Episode 14, Trusts and Family Governance, Preventing Conflict Before It Starts. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Fell, and welcome to Trust Unpacked, where we strip away myth and marketing and explain in plain terms how trusts actually work in real family situations. For the past 20 years, my fiduciary work has focused almost entirely on the architecture of trusts, the skill of trusteeship, and the challenge of long-term family governance, not as a technical exercise, but as a human one. In doing so, I've had the privilege to advise hundreds of families, as well as institutions and advisors across the world. Alongside that advisory work, I'm a published author. I recently completed a trilogy that reflects both the technical and the human dimensions of the fiduciary and private banking fields. Before we begin, a brief but important note. This podcast is provided for general information and discussion only. It does not constitute legal, tax, fiduciary, or professional advice, and it should not be relied upon as such. You should always seek advice from appropriately qualified professionals in your relevant jurisdiction before making decisions or taking action. Now, this session sits at an important junction in the series. So far, we've examined trusts as legal structures. We've explored roles, powers, discretion, administration, decision-making, and protection. Today, we turn to something far less technical, but often far more decisive, and the last episode in our group dealing with decision-making, governance, and administration of trusts. And that is family governance. Most trust disputes are not caused by a bad law. They're caused by poor alignment between a trust structure and the family it serves. This session looks at how trusts interact with family dynamics and how thoughtful governance can prevent conflict long before it becomes visible. So let's get one thing clear. Trusts do not sit outside the family. A trust is often presented as a neutral container. In practice, it's not neutral at all. It sits inside a family system. It reflects that system. And over time, it amplifies what is already done. Unspoken expectations, sibling rivalry, different attitudes to money, effort, and entitlement, lack of loyalty. A trust does not resolve these issues. It exposes them. Good governance acknowledges this reality. Poor governance ignores it and hopes for the best. Let me show you what I mean by loyalty and what it looks like when it becomes the difference between fracture and continuity. Some years ago, I was asked to advise a Middle Eastern family shortly after the death of their father. He'd been a discreet but very influential figure, deeply religious, deeply private, and respected across a wide, extended family. His children, a brother and sister born a year apart, had been raised with a strong sense of duty, restraint, and mutual care. Loyalty was not spoken about. It was practiced. Now, under religious inheritance rules, the brother was entitled to twice the share of his sister. No one disputed this. It was understood, expected. And yet, when the time came to decide how the estate should be structured, the brother hesitated. He understood the law, he respected the tradition, but he also understood his sister. She was financially independent, intellectually formidable, and deeply committed to the same values their parents had lived by. Treating her as some kind of subordinate felt like a betrayal of what their father had actually taught them. So, rather than enforcing his advantage, he proposed something unusual. Each sibling would contribute their inheritance into an irrevocable trust as a lifetime gift. They would then become beneficiaries on equal footing with an independent trustee. The structure would honor faith, preserve dignity, and allow both of them to fund charitable projects aligned with their beliefs. The reaction from the wider family was mixed. Some saw wisdom, others saw weakness. A few saw danger in setting precedent. The pressure was low-key, but persistent. It would have been easy for him to retreat, to say the moment was not right. He did not. This is where loyalty became visible, not as sentiment, but as resolve. My role was not to arbitrate values. It was to create a structure that could hold them without distortion. The trust was designed carefully. with clear governance, mutual veto rights, and disciplined distribution policies, not to equalize outcomes mechanically, but to protect balance over time. What followed was instructive. There were years when the sister drew more, funding healthcare projects in underserved regions. Other years, the brother required greater support for long-term environmental initiatives. Each decision was made transparently, calmly, and without comparison. The trust absorbed pressure that might otherwise have turned personal. More importantly, the siblings continued to meet, to talk, to decide together. The trust did not replace loyalty. It preserved it. This is the essence of family governance. Structures do not create commitment. They only give it somewhere to live. Where loyalty exists, governance can prevent conflict. Where it does not, no amount of drafting will compensate. Trustees often underestimate this. They look for solutions in documents, committees, and policies. But families fracture not because of technical failure, but because someone stops caring enough to stay fully engaged. Loyalty is what keeps people at the table when outcomes are uncertain and emotions are raw. It's what allows trustees to govern without becoming referees, and it is what turns a trust from a defensive mechanism into a shared institution. In this case, loyalty did not demand agreement. It demanded presence, and that, more than anything else, is what allowed the trust to endure. So when I say that conflict usually starts unremarkably, what do I mean? Most trust conflicts don't begin with litigation, they begin with misunderstanding. A beneficiary assumes fairness means equality, another assumes need should come first. A trustee assumes silence means acceptance. Over time, these assumptions harden, resentment grows unnoticed. Decisions are reinterpreted emotionally. Trust erodes before anyone notices. By the time laws are involved, positions have already solidified. Governance exists to surface difference early, while it is still manageable. So what does family governance actually mean? Well, family governance is not about control, and it's not about imposing hierarchy. At its core, it is about clarity of roles, clarity of process, clarity of communication. In a trust context, governance may include agreed principles about how decisions are made, clear explanation of trustee direct discretion, forums for discussion that are separate from decision-making, education for beneficiaries about the trust structure. Governance isn't about giving everyone a vote. It's about giving everyone understanding. And that's a big difference. One of the most effective governance disciplines is separation. Family conversations should exist. Trustee decisions should exist, but they should not be confused. When beneficiaries believe discussion equals decision, disappointment is pre-programmed. Clear governance creates different spaces: a space for listening, a space for explanation, and a space where trustees exercise judgment. This protects everyone. Trustees are able to decide without undue pressure. Family members are able to speak without false expectations. Blurring these boundaries is one of the most common causes of conflict. Many families underestimate the value of education, not technical training, conceptual understanding, helping beneficiaries understand what discretion really means, why uncertainty is part of the design, and why trustees cannot promise outcomes. Education doesn't eliminate disappointment, but it certainly reduces surprise. Surprise is often what turns disappointment into anger. Families that invest early in explanation tend to face fewer disputes later. Now, the structures for expected governance are usually modest. Regular but limited communication, clear written principles, consistent messaging over time. They're not elaborate councils or complex charters, unless the family generally needs them. Governance should fit the family, not the other way around. When governance becomes performative, it loses credibility. When it becomes habitual, it becomes protective. Now, in many families, governance is complicated by one simple fact. and that is that the founder is still present, sometimes physically, sometimes psychologically. Even after death, the founder's shadow can dominate decision-making. Founders often build well through force of personality, decisive, resilient, intolerant of weakness, accustomed to control. These traits create success in business, but they do not always translate well into shared family stewardship. Where a founder continues to intervene in trustee decisions, question distributions, or signal preferred beneficiaries, governance weakens. Where a founder refuses to explain their intentions clearly, uncertainty expands. Where a founder avoids difficult conversations about succession, silence becomes dangerous. Good governance requires a gradual transition. It requires a founder to move from operator to architect, from decision maker to principle setter. That shift is uncomfortable, but without it, the trust structure becomes performative. The trustees appear to hold discretion. In reality, influence remains concentrated, and the next generation observes this contradiction carefully. If they see governance undermined, they will replicate that pattern later. Founders set culture not only by what they build, but by how they let go. Let's look now at equality and fairness, because I've mentioned it a few times. And few issues create more tension in family trusts than the question of fairness. Equality feels simple. Divide evenly, treat everyone the same. But families are rarely symmetrical. Children differ. Circumstances differ. Needs differ. Contribution differs. A rigid commitment to equality can increase injustice. Equally, a flexible approach based on need can create resentment if poorly explained. Governance must create a language around these concepts. What does fairness mean in this family? Is the trust designed to equalize opportunity, to respond to need, to reward responsibility, to protect against imprudence? If these questions are not addressed explicitly, beneficiaries construct their own narratives, and those narratives are rarely aligned. I've seen siblings who interpreted discretionary distributions as moral judgment. One saw support as affirmation. Another saw the absence of support as criticism. And in reality, trustees were applying a coherent policy, but the policy had never been articulated. Governance does not eliminate difficult decisions. It simply clarifies the framework within which they are made. Clarity reduces the emotional weight of outcomes. So what is the role of the trustee in all of this? In well-governed families, trustees act as stabilizers, not distant administrators, not family therapists, but disciplined fiduciaries who provide consistency over time. And consistency is underestimated. When trustees communicate clearly, follow established principles, and avoid reactive decisions, they reduce volatility. Families often experience emotional cycles, moments of optimism, followed by moments of frustration, followed by moments of conflict. Trustees should not mirror these cycles, they should absorb them. Stability builds credibility. Credibility builds trust. And trust reduces escalation. Where trustees are inconsistent, opaque, or overly informal, uncertainty grows. Uncertainty breeds suspicion, suspicion breeds conflict, and professional distance, exercised respectfully, is not coldness, it's protection. Transparency is frequently advocated as a cure for conflict, and transparency matters, but it must be calibrated. Too little information creates distrust. Too much information can create confusion or unnecessary comparison. Not every beneficiary needs access to every detail, but every beneficiary should understand the purpose of the trust, the role of the trustee, the principles guiding distributions, and the boundaries of discretion. Financial reporting should be clear and proportionate. Opaque structures invite speculation, yet over-disclosure can unintentionally inflame rivalry. For example, detailed disclosure of individual distributions among siblings may create competitive dynamics. Governance should therefore consider not only legal obligations, but psychological effects. Transparency is not about volume of transparency, it's about its clarity. Family meetings can either prevent conflict or accelerate it. Structure matters, purpose matters, frequency matters. A well-designed family meeting has a clear agenda, separates information from decision, allows questions without promising outcomes, respects time and boundaries, includes education where appropriate. They shouldn't be crisis-driven. If families only gather when there is tension, association becomes negative. Regular, modest meetings create rhythm. Rhythm creates familiarity. Familiarity reduces anxiety. Trustees must manage expectations carefully. Listening does not equal agreeing. Discussion does not equal commitment. Clear framing at the outset prevents misunderstandings later. Now let's look at the next generation and identity, because trusts intersect with identity in subtle ways. The younger beneficiaries, the existence of a trust can shape their whole life, their whole self-perception. Am I independent? Am I privileged? Am I trusted? Am I controlled? Governance must address this directly. Education should include not only technical explanation, but discussion about responsibility. What does it mean to be a beneficiary? What is expected? What is not expected? Silence leaves space for distortion. Some beneficiaries overestimate their entitlement. Others underestimate their agency. A well-governed trust communicates that capital is a resource, not a substitute for effort. Discretion is not punishment, nor is it approval. It is structure. Families who articulate this clearly tend to experience healthier engagement from younger members. So how do we manage the in-laws and the extended family? Many trust conflicts emerge not between siblings, but at the boundaries: spouses, partners, extended relatives. In-laws often bring different cultural assumptions about money and entitlement. Exclusion creates suspicion. Over-inclusion creates complexity. Governance must define the perimeter. Are spouses informed? Are they beneficiaries? Are they participants in meetings? Is there a policy around marital breakdown? Avoiding these questions does not prevent them arising. It merely delays confrontation. Clear policy, explained calmly and early, reduces personalization later. Families who handle these boundaries thoughtfully reduce the risk of conflict expanding outward. Most families assume they will handle conflict if it arises. Few define how. Governance can include simple conflict protocols. If disagreement escalates, what happens? Is there a mediator identified in advance? Is there a process for internal review? Are these principles in place to guide communication? Pre-agreed processes reduce panic. They also reduce performative escalation. When beneficiaries know there is a structured path for concerns, they're less likely to resort immediately to legal action. The existence of process can itself prevent the use of process. Avoidance is also common in affluent families. Difficult conversations are postponed. Ambiguities are tolerated. Tension is managed socially rather than structurally. This works until it does not. The longer issues remain unspoken, the heavier they become. I've observed families where minor understandings accumulated silently for years, a distribution that felt uneven, a comment that felt dismissive, a meeting where someone felt unheard. None of these justified dispute individually, but collectively they created narrative. And narrative, once formed, is powerful. Governance exists to prevent narrative drift. It surfaces issues early. It legitimizes questions. It reduces the emotional charge of clarification. Avoidance is comfortable in the short term. It is very expensive in the long term. What about cultural sensitivity in governance? Because families are rarely culturally uniform. There are cross-border marriages, education abroad, business across jurisdictions. Trust structures often span multiple legal systems. Governance must recognize cultural variation. attitudes towards authority, attitudes towards equality, attitudes towards transparency. A governance model that works in one cultural context may feel entirely alien in another. Sensitivity does not mean dilution of principles. It means thoughtful adaptation. Trustees who understand cultural nuance are better positioned to maintain cohesion. Uniformity is not the objective. Stability is. Governance should therefore not be static. As families grow, age, and diversify, structures may need adjustment. What worked for 3 siblings may not work for 12 cousins. What worked during active business expansion may not suit a diversified investment phase. Periodic governance review is healthy, not because something is wrong, but because change is natural. Review demonstrates seriousness. It signals that governance is intentional, not accidental. Families who revisit their principles tend to strengthen. Those who assume permanence risk misalignment. So trustees often act as translators between generations. They translate legal structure into human meaning. They translate emotional concerns into structured response. They translate principle into practice. This role requires huge patience. It also requires clarity. And above all, it requires restraint. You see, trustees who overstep into advocacy lose neutrality. Trustees who retreat into silence lose relevance. The balance you want to achieve lies in consistent explanation without alignment to factions. Neutrality is not passivity. It is disciplined fairness. Families notice this over time, and that notice builds institutional trust. So how can you tell when family governance is successful? The success of family governance is rarely dramatic. It's invisible. It appears as the absence of crisis, as a continuation of conversation, as the cool handling of disagreement, as the absence of litigation. This invisibility can make governance feel unnecessary until something breaks. Families who have invested early in governance often struggle to articulate what it has prevented, but they feel the difference. There's less suspicion, less comparison, less escalation. Trust structures operate within a stable emotional climate. That stability is not accidental. It's designed. At its core, family governance within trust is an expression of stewardship, not only of capital, but of relationships, of values, of continuity. Trusts provide legal architecture. Governance provides human architecture. One without the other is incomplete. A technically flawless trust can fracture a family if governance is absent. A modest trust can endure across generations if governance is thoughtful. Conflict prevention is not about control, it's about clarity. It's about presence. It's about discipline in communication and consistency in decision-making. Families who understand this build institutions, not just structures. And institutions, unlike documents, can adapt and endure. However, as families grow in wealth and complexity, decisions do multiply. Investment choices, distribution requests, philanthropic initiatives, education funding, property acquisitions. If every issue is elevated to collective debate, fatigue sets in. Decision fatigue is rarely discussed in family governance, yet it is very real. When beneficiaries are required to engage constantly, engagement deteriorates. When trustees are drawn into excessive consultation, authority weakens. Good governance defines which decisions require collective awareness, which require consultation, and which remain firmly within trustee discretion. Not every matter deserves equal attention after all. Clear thresholds reduce friction. For example, routine distributions may follow established criteria without family discussion. Extraordinary capital requests may trigger structured review. Philanthropic initiatives above a certain level may involve broader consultation. Designed governance with tiered engagement prevents overload. It preserves energy for issues that truly matter. Families that ignore this often find meetings crowded with detail, but empty of strategic focus. As generations expand, informal alliances form. Cousins align around shared interests, siblings align around historical grievances, spouses align around protective instincts. These alliances are not inherently negative, they're human. But when governance does not provide transparent process, informal coalitions can begin to influence trust dynamics indirectly. Private lobbying of trustees, selective sharing of information, subtle pressure through social channels. Trustees must be alert to this dynamic. Fair governance requires that information flow through agreed channels. If one group gains privileged access, perceived imbalance follows. Clear communication protocols prevent triangulation. All significant matters should be addressed in structured meetings, not through informal persuasion. When families understand that private influence will not alter formal process, behavior improves. Now, I've mentioned philanthropy before, and in this episode. And in many families, philanthropy provides a neutral field. Unlike distributions for personal use, charitable initiatives often unite rather than divide. A trust can incorporate structured philanthropic engagement, a shared charitable committee, a defined annual allocation for collective projects, opportunities for young members to research and present initiatives. Philanthropy shifts focus outward. It reframes wealth as responsibility rather than entitlement. Importantly, governance around philanthropy should be distinct from personal benefit discussions. This separation prevents confusion between generosity towards society and generosity towards oneself. Families that invest in shared external purpose often experience stronger internal cohesion, not because disagreement disappears, but because shared action tempers rivalry. So how does one manage sudden wealth events within a trust? Liquidity events test governance, a major sale, an unexpected windfall, a significant capital realization within the trust. Sudden increase in available capital changes psychology. Beneficiaries who were previously patient may now accelerate expectations. Trustees may feel pressure to distribute more quickly. Without pre-existing principles, volatility increases. Governance should anticipate liquidity events before they occur. Is capital to be preserved primarily? Is there a defined reinvestment ratio? Are distributions capped in early years following a sale? Pre-agreed parameters prevent reactive generosity or reactive restriction. Windfalls magnify whatever governance foundations are already in place. If the foundation is clear, stability follows. If it is vague, tension rises sharply. Modern families are geographically dispersed, different time zones, different legal systems, different lifestyles. Governance must adapt technologically. Virtual meetings, secure document portals, recorded educational sessions, digital access to trust reports. However, digital convenience should not eliminate periodic in-person engagement. Human connection strengthens institutional trust. A balance between efficiency and presence is necessary. Families that rely exclusively on digital interaction may experience subtle distancing. Conversely, insisting on frequent physical meetings may create unnecessary burden. Governance must accommodate mobility without sacrificing cohesion. Beyond conceptual education, financial literacy matters. Beneficiaries who understand basic financial principles engage far more constructively. Investment risk, diversification, liquidity constraints, tax considerations. Without this understanding, trustee decisions can appear arbitrary. Financial literacy is not about turning beneficiaries into portfolio managers. It's about enabling informed conversation. Structured educational sessions, delivered periodically, can elevate discourse. Families that neglect this often experience frustration rooted not in disagreement, but in misunderstanding of constraints. Informed beneficiaries are calmer beneficiaries. Now let's talk about an uncomfortable subject, and that is death. Because after death, there is an emotional aftermath. Transitions following death are particularly sensitive. Even well-governed families experience emotional vulnerability. Grief distorts perception. Old rivalries can resurface. Expectations may crystallize prematurely. Trustees must navigate this period with heightened awareness. Early communication should be clear but restrained. Avoid rushed structural changes. Allow space for emotional processing before engaging in major governance shifts. Governance frameworks should anticipate this period. Define timelines for estate integration, clear explanation of interim arrangements, structured support for beneficiaries. Stability during transition preserves trust in the system. Now, healthy governance depends on boundaries between trustee and beneficiary roles, between family and business, between individual autonomy and collective responsibility. When boundaries blur, confusion multiplies. For example, beneficiaries employed within family businesses must understand that employment performance and trust distributions are distinct. Trustees must resist pressure to reward or penalize employment conduct through trust mechanisms. Clear boundary articulation prevents instrumentalization of the trust. The trust is not a behavioral management tool, it's a fiduciary structure. Maintaining that distinction protects legitimacy. As generations expand, lifestyle divergence increases. One beneficiary may pursue entrepreneurial risk, another may prefer stability. One may live modestly, another more expensively. Governance should not attempt to homogenize lifestyle, but it should define how lifestyle interacts with distributions. Is the trust designed to maintain baseline security, to enable ambition, to moderate excess? Articulating these parameters prevents silent judgment. Trustees cannot police lifestyle, but they can apply consistent principles. Clarity reduces personalization. And when we talk about clarity, we should also talk about the clarity of language, because language is important. Language shapes perception. How trustees describe distributions matters. Support rather than allowance, allocation rather than a gift, review rather than approval. Small linguistic differences influence emotional response. Governance should include conscious attention to communication tone. Neutral language reduces unintended hierarchy. Respectful language maintains dignity. Consistent terminology reinforces institutional identity. Words accumulate meaning over time. Disciplined language strengthens governance. Now, patience as a governance virtue. It may sound illogical, but hear me out. Perhaps the most underestimated quality in family governance is indeed patience. Generational wealth operates on long horizons. Disagreements that feel urgent often soften with time. Trustees and families alike benefit from resisting immediate reaction. Structured pause mechanisms can be useful, cooling off periods before final decisions, opportunity for written reflection before formal meetings. Time reduces emotional intensity. Patience does not mean avoidance, it just means deliberate pacing. Families who cultivate patience reduce impulsive fracture. Ultimately, governance is not a document. It's not a charter placed in a drawer. It's practice, repeated behavior, reinforced norms, consistent process. Trust structures endure not because they are perfect, but because they are tended. Governance requires maintenance, periodic review, renewed explanation, adaptation to circumstance. Families who understand governance as practice rather than policy are more resilient. They treat it as a living architecture. And living architecture, unlike static drafting, involves and evolves without losing integrity. Of course, family governance doesn't operate in isolation from external influence. Lawyers, accountants, investment advisors, and consultants often interact with the individual family members separately. Each advisor may provide technically sound advice, but when advice is delivered in isolation, alignment can fracture. One beneficiary may be told they are entitled to more. Another may be advised to challenge process. A founder may receive guidance that conflicts with trustee discretion. Governance should address how external advice interfaces with the trust. Clear policy can help. Encourage beneficiaries to bring external views into structured discussion rather than private escalation. Trustees should be open to external input, but not reactive to it. When external advisors understand the governance framework, they're less likely to try and destabilize it. Coordination matters. Without a professional advice, it can amplify division rather than resolve it. Let's talk about reputation, because reputation doesn't exist in a family. It doesn't exist only in public. Over time, individuals develop reputational identities: the responsible one, the risk taker, the difficult one, the favored one. These labels influence how trustees' decisions are interpreted. A distribution to the responsible sibling may be seen as reinforcement. A denial to the risk taker may be seen as predictable censure. Governance should avoid embedding reputational narratives. Each request should be assessed independently. Each beneficiary should be treated as capable of change. When families feel permanently categorized, defensiveness increases. Trust governance works best when it leaves room for evolution. No individual should feel defined by past behavior, at least not indefinitely. Information is not only about content, it's also about timing. Late communication creates suspicion. Premature communication can create unnecessary alarm. Governance should consider when information is shared. For example, during investment volatility, proactive explanations may prevent anxiety. During routine periods, however, excessive updates may create noise. Similarly, when difficult decisions are pending, preparing beneficiaries for outcome before finalization can reduce shock. Timing is subtle, but subtlety matters. Trustees who communicate thoughtfully about timing build credibility. Let's talk about autonomy within a structure. You see, a trust inevitably introduces structure, but beneficiaries still require autonomy. Governance can encourage individual initiative within defined boundaries. For example, defined personal allocation pools, matching funding for entrepreneurial projects, structured support for education or venture initiatives. These mechanisms provide agency without dissolving oversight. When beneficiaries feel trusted within limits, engagement increases. Excessive restriction can create rebellion. Excessive freedom can create instability. Structured autonomy strikes that balance. Finally, governance should consider legacy beyond capital, values, narrative, purpose. Why was this wealth created? What is it intended to sustain? If governance focuses solely on mechanics, meaning erodes. Families that articulate shared narrative experience deeper cohesion. Finally, let's look at legacy beyond wealth. Governance should consider legacy beyond capital, values, narrative, purpose. Why was this wealth created? What is it intended to sustain? If governance focuses solely on mechanics, meaning erodes, families that articulate shared narrative experience deeper cohesion. Trust structures then become vehicles of continuity, not merely financial instruments. Narrative does not eliminate disagreement, but it does contextualize it. When beneficiaries understand that they are stewards of something larger than just personal allocation, perspective shifts, and perspective, more than policy, often determines whether conflict takes root. So at the end of this episode, what are the key takeaways? Family governance is not an accessory to a trust, it's a condition for its survival. If there are key takeaways from this episode, they are the following. Firstly, that a trust does not sit outside the family. It amplifies whatever already exists. Alignment, loyalty, and clarity will be strengthened. Silence, rivalry, and ambiguity will be exposed. Second, that most conflict begins unnoticed. Misunderstanding hardens into narrative. Narrative hardens into position. Third, clarity matters more than control. Clarity of roles, clarity of discretion, clarity of process. Beneficiaries don't need votes, they need understanding. Fourth, that separation protects everyone. Family discussion must not be confused with trustee decision-making. When boundaries blur, expectations distort. Fifth, education reduces shock. When beneficiaries understand the architecture, disappointment does not automatically become anger. Sixth, governance must be proportionate and lived. Modest, consistent structures outperform elaborate, performative ones. Seventh, timing, language, and tone shape perception. How and when trustees communicate is as important as what they decide. Eighth, governance must evolve. Families change. Generations expand. Structures that are reviewed deliberately endure. And finally, the governance is stewardship, not only of capital, but of relationships and values. A technically sound trust without human alignment will fracture. Conflict prevention is not dramatic. It's disciplined, modest, consistent. And when it works, it's almost invisible. And that was Trust and Family Governance Unpacked. We've now completed the group of episodes covering decision-making, governance, and administration. Join me in the next episode, the first of the next group, looking at risk, psychology, and failure, where we will examine trusts and their role in asset protection. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fellen.